The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was not a season that arrived with gentle warnings or subtle shifts in the air. It was a conquest. The wind, born in the vast, frozen emptiness of the north, scoured the plains, carrying a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight. It was a cold that did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest logs, found the smallest cracks in the daubing, and settled deep in the bones of man and beast. For the settlers in the small, hopeful cluster of cabins known as Providence, survival was a battle fought hour by hour, measured in armloads of firewood and the inches of frost that grew on the inside of their walls. The cold was a thief. It stole the heat from their hearths almost as soon as the fire gave it. A man could stand close enough to the stove to feel his front scorch, while his back remained chilled to the marrow. At night, families huddled together under every blanket and pelt they owned, listening to the cabin timbers groan and pop under the immense pressure of the contracting frost. Water left in a bucket just a few feet from the fire would be a solid block of ice by morning. The sound of the wind was a constant, mournful howl, a predator circling their fragile shelters, testing for weakness. It was a relentless siege, and every cabin in Providence was losing. They all built the same way. The knowledge had been passed down from the first pioneers who had dared to put down roots in this unforgiving soil. You felled the thickest cottonwoods you could find, squared them as best you could, and chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud, grass, and animal hair. You built a large stone fireplace on one wall, big enough to take a whole log, and you fed it constantly. The wisdom was simple. A bigger fire meant more heat. A thicker wall meant more protection. Yet the evidence of their failure was everywhere. It was in the pale, drawn faces of their children, in the constant, racking coughs that echoed through the settlement, and in the ever-dwindling stacks of firewood that were meant to last until April, but looked as if they might not make it to February. In a small cabin at the western edge of the settlement lived a woman named Ilara. She was a widow, her husband taken by a prairie fever 2 summers before. She lived with her 2 small children, a girl named Lise, who was 6, and a boy, Tomas, who was 4. Ilara was quiet and kept mostly to herself, a fact that the other settlers attributed to her grief, or perhaps the shyness of an outsider. She was not from this land. She had come from a place of high, jagged mountains in the old country, a place where the snows were deep and the winters were long, but where people had learned to live with the cold, not just fight it. She watched the men of Providence shore up their walls with more mud and saw them fell more trees, and in her quiet way, she saw the futility of it. They were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with infinite reserves. One brisk morning in late autumn, when the first true bite of winter was in the air, the other settlers saw Ilara doing something strange. In front of her cabin door, she was marking out a small rectangle in the dirt with a pointed stick. It was about 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, directly attached to the front of her home. Magnus, the settlement's most respected builder, a large man with a booming voice and hands as tough as cured leather, was walking past with 2 other men. He stopped, a condescending smile spreading across his bearded face. He watched her for a moment as she scratched the lines, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What's this then, Ilara?" Magnus called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "Planning a summer garden in October?" The other men chuckled, their breath puffing out in white clouds. Ilara looked up, her expression unreadable. She did not flush with embarrassment or bristle at his tone. She simply met his gaze. "I am planning a vestibule," she said, her voice soft but clear. Magnus squinted. "A what?" "Speak plainly, woman. That's a fancy word for a simple box." He gestured dismissively at the rectangle in the dirt. "What's it for?" "It is to stop the cold," she replied. Her answer was so simple, so direct, that it sounded foolish to them. Magnus let out a short, barking laugh. "Stop the cold? With a little box on your door?" "The cold, my dear woman, is everywhere. It comes through the walls. It comes down the chimney. The only way to fight it is with a hot fire and thick logs, not with whatever that is." He nudged the dirt with the toe of his boot, smudging her careful lines. "This will do nothing but trap the snow and make it harder for you to get in and out. It is a waste of your time and a waste of good stone." She did not argue. She simply said, "In my homeland, this is how we build. The cold must have a place to die before it can enter the house." This statement was met with genuine bewilderment, followed by more laughter. The concept was alien to them. Cold was a presence to be driven out with heat, not a thing to be trapped or tricked. "A place for the cold to die?" one of the other men repeated, shaking his head in amusement. "I've never heard such nonsense. You'll be building a house for the winter itself, right on your doorstep." The men walked away, their laughter trailing behind them, leaving Alara alone with her drawing in the dirt. The story of the widow's cold trap spread through Providence that day, a bit of comic relief in the face of their shared anxiety. They saw her as a foolish dreamer, a woman whose grief had perhaps unsettled her mind. Despite the mockery, Alara began her work. Her plan was not just a simple box. The lines she had drawn were for a foundation. She began to dig, not deep, but about 2 feet down into the hard, cold earth. The men who saw her shook their heads. Digging was for root cellars, not for porches. The ground was already stiffening with the coming freeze, and the labor was arduous. She used her late husband's shovel and pickaxe, her small frame straining with each swing, each shovelful of dirt. Her children, Lisa and Tomas, watched from the doorway, wrapped in shawls, their faces solemn. They were too young to understand the principles of thermodynamics, but they understood their mother's fierce determination. They understood this was for them. Next came the stones. The plains were not rich with good building rock, but the creek bed, a half-mile away, was littered with them, smoothed and rounded by centuries of flowing water. She did not have a wagon or an ox. She had a wheelbarrow. For 2 weeks, from sunup until the light failed, Alara made the journey back and forth, back and forth. Each trip was a monumental effort. She would choose the stones carefully, not just the largest ones, but ones that would fit together. She loaded the wheelbarrow until she could barely push it, her muscles burning, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The path was uneven, and more than once the wheelbarrow tipped, spilling its hard-won cargo. She would stop, rest her aching back, and then patiently, one by one, load the stones back in. While she toiled, the rest of Providence was a hive of activity, but of a different kind. Magnus and the other men were busy with their own winter preparations, done the traditional way. They were felling the last of the accessible trees, their axes ringing out in the cold air. They were mixing huge batches of daubing, racing against the first deep freeze that would make the mud unusable. They worked with a frantic, hurried energy, a stark contrast to Alara's slow, deliberate pace. They were patching, reinforcing, adding another layer to a flawed design. She was building something entirely new. They saw her solitary labor and pitied her. They saw her small, growing pile of rocks and scoffed. Magnus, passing by one afternoon, saw her struggling with the wheelbarrow and called out, "You'll break your back for a pile of rubble, Alara. There's still time to fix your chinking the right way." She gave him a small, polite nod and kept working. Her isolation was complete. The other women of the settlement, who might have normally offered help or companionship, kept their distance. Their husbands had declared Alara's project a folly, and they did not wish to be associated with it. They would watch her from their windows as they mended clothes or prepared meals, whispering among themselves. They saw a woman working a man's job alone, and it made them uncomfortable. Her project defied the community's norms, and in a place where conformity meant survival, her divergence was seen as a dangerous eccentricity. But Ilara was not building for them. She was building for Lisa and Tomas. She was building from a memory of her grandfather's house, nestled in a high mountain pass, a house that was always calm and warm, even when the blizzards raged for weeks. Once she had a large enough pile of stones, the construction began. This was the part that required not just strength, but precision. She laid the foundation stones in the trench she had dug, fitting them together like a puzzle. Then she began to build the walls. They were thick, nearly 2 feet from outside to inside. She was not just stacking rocks. She was carefully choosing each one, turning it over and over, finding how it best locked with the one below it. She used a mortar of clay and sand, packing it into every crevice. Her hands, unused to such rough labor, were soon cracked and bleeding. She would clean them at night, wrap them in rags, and begin again the next day. The design was deceptively simple. The floor of the vestibule was lower than the floor of the cabin, creating a small, sunken pit. The stone walls were massive, designed to absorb and hold the cold. There would be 2 doors, a heavy, rough-hewn outer door, and her cabin's original, lighter inner door. The space between them was the key. It was an airlock. It was a buffer zone where the raw, brutal cold of the outside world would be trapped and tamed before it could touch the inner door. The mass of the stone, she knew, would act as a thermal battery, but for the cold. It would draw the chill into itself, leaving the air in the vestibule still and cold, but not savagely so. When the outer door was opened, the wind would rush in, but it would have nowhere to go. It would swirl in the small stone room, its energy dissipating against the massive walls. By the time the outer door was closed and the inner door was opened, only a puff of calm, cold air would enter the cabin, not a violent, heat-sucking gale. She worked tirelessly, fueled by a quiet, unshakable conviction. The men had built their cabins to be fortresses against the wind, but they had built them wrong. Their single doors opened directly to the elements. Every time someone entered or left, a huge volume of precious warm air was violently exchanged for a blast of Arctic cold. Their fireplaces, built directly into the walls, were inefficient, with much of the heat radiating uselessly outwards into the frozen wilderness or escaping directly up the chimney. They were trying to heat the entire Dakota Territory, one log at a time. Ilara's plan was different. It was not about generating more heat. It was about losing less of it. It was about creating a gradient, a series of layers between her family and the killing cold. Her little stone box was not a folly. It was a carefully engineered system. By the time the first snows began to fall in earnest, her vestibule was complete. It was not a beautiful structure. It was squat, crude, and purely functional, a stone appendage grafted onto the front of her log cabin. The roof was a simple plank construction, sealed with pitch. The outer door was heavy and ill-fitting, but it was solid. To the rest of Providence, it looked even more ridiculous now that it was finished. It was an ugly, useless lump. The children of the settlement, echoing their parents, took to calling it the widow's ice house. Ilara ignored them all. She moved her firewood from its exposed position at the side of the cabin into the new vestibule, where it would be dry and accessible. She checked the seal on her inner door. She was ready. The winter of 1883 did not just arrive, it attacked. In the second week of December, the sky turned a flat, metallic gray, and the temperature plummeted. The wind picked up, not in gusts, but in a solid, unceasing wall of force. This was not a normal storm. The old-timers, who had seen 20 winters on the plains, had never felt a cold like this. It was a cold that had teeth. Snow began to fall, not in soft flakes, but in tiny, hard grains, like sand, driven almost horizontally by the wind. The settlers called it a blizzard, but it was more than that. It was a white hurricane, a maelstrom of ice and wind that erased the world. Within hours, Providence was buried. The snow drifted into immense dunes, swallowing fences and covering windows. The world outside the cabins became a churning, featureless void of white. The temperature, had anyone been able to measure it, was well below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind howled with a sound like a freight train, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated through the very logs of the cabins. It was a physical assault. The wind found every tiny crack, every weak point in the chinking, and forced its way in. It came in as a fine, crystalline powder that dusted the floors and furniture, and as a draft so sharp and persistent it felt like a knife. Inside the cabins of Providence, the battle for survival became desperate. The traditional methods were failing, catastrophically. The huge fireplaces, which had seemed so robust, were now liabilities. The immense draw of air they needed to burn fed the flames, but it also sucked the warm air out of the room and pulled more freezing air in through 1,000 tiny gaps. Families were burning through their woodpiles at a terrifying rate. A man would haul in an armload of wood, and it would be gone in an hour, producing a bubble of heat that extended only a few feet from the hearth before the overwhelming cold crushed it. In Magnus's cabin, the situation was grim. He had the largest, best-built home in the settlement, a source of great pride. But now, that pride was freezing to death. Frost, thick and feathery like the down of a goose, coated the inside of his walls. He and his wife had hung blankets over the door and windows, but the cold pushed through them as if they were not there. His children were huddled by the fire, wrapped in everything they owned, their faces blue-tinged and listless. The fire roared, consuming log after log, but the room grew colder. The wind hammered at the walls, and with every powerful gust, the single door rattled in its frame, letting in a fresh wave of Arctic air. Magnus, the master builder, the man who knew how to conquer this land, was watching his own family freeze in his own home. He was wrong. Now, shift the focus to the western edge of the settlement, to the small cabin with the ugly stone box on its front. Outside, the same white hurricane raged. The wind shrieked and tore at the little structure. The snow piled up against its stone walls. But inside Ilara's home, something remarkable was happening. There was stillness. The deafening roar of the wind was muted, reduced to a distant, hollow moan. There were no drafts, not a single one. The fine, powdery snow was not dusting the floor. The air was cool, but it was a calm, even coolness, not the biting, aggressive cold that plagued the other cabins. The system was working. The stone vestibule was taking the full fury of the storm. The wind smashed against its solid walls and broke, its energy spent. The snow swirled and eddied around it, but the outer door held firm. Inside the vestibule, the air was intensely cold, just as she had designed. The stones had absorbed the chill, becoming a barrier of pure cold. But it was a static cold, a dead cold. The airlock was holding. Inside the main cabin, Ilara and her children were comfortable. The small stove glowed with a modest, steady fire. She had used less than a quarter of the wood that Magnus had burned, yet the warmth it produced filled the small, sealed space. Lisa and Tomas were not huddled by the fire. They were playing on a rug in the middle of the floor, their cheeks rosy, not blue. Ilara sat in a chair, mending a sock, her movements calm and unhurried. Every hour or so she would need more wood. She would rise, open the inner door, and step into the vestibule. A small puff of frigid, still air would enter the cabin, but it was insignificant. She would close the inner door behind her, sealing the warmth in. In the frigid twilight of the stone room, she would gather a few logs, then reverse the process. Open the outer door, step out, close it, open the inner door, and be back in her calm, warm haven. The entire process took less than 30 seconds. The heat loss was minimal. It worked. For 2 days and 2 nights, the storm raged without pause. In the rest of Providence, desperation turned to fear, and fear turned to panic. Several families ran out of firewood completely. The cold in their homes became unbearable, a lethal, penetrating force. In Magnus's house, the temperature had dropped below freezing. The blankets on their beds were stiff with frost. His youngest son was shivering uncontrollably, his breathing shallow. Magnus knew they would not last another night. He had to do something. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. There was only one place he could think of, one desperate, foolish hope: the widow's ice house. Bundling himself in every layer he owned, Magnus plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The cold was shocking, instantly numbing his exposed face. He could not see more than 5 feet in front of him. He navigated by memory, stumbling through drifts that were waist-deep, his body screaming in protest. The journey, which would normally take 2 minutes, took him almost 20. He was guided by the faint, muffled sound of the wind striking something solid. He finally bumped into a wall of stone. He felt his way along it until his frozen hands found the handle of Ilara's outer door. He pulled, and it swung open into the dead, still cold of the vestibule. He stumbled inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The roaring of the wind instantly ceased. The silence was absolute and unnerving. He was in a small, dark space, bitterly cold, but the violent, soul-crushing assault of the wind was gone. He took a moment to catch his breath, his lungs burning. He could feel the cold radiating from the stone walls around him. He fumbled for the inner door, his hands clumsy and numb. He knocked weakly. The door opened, and a wave of calm, dry warmth washed over him. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of a roaring fire, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to fill the very air. It was the most wonderful thing he had ever felt. Ilara stood there, holding a small lamp. Her face showed no surprise, no triumph, only a quiet concern. Behind her, he could see her 2 children, sleeping peacefully in their beds, not huddled by the fire. The air in the cabin was still. The flame in her lamp burned straight and tall, not flickering in a draft. In that single moment, Magnus understood everything. He saw the irrefutable truth of her wisdom and the catastrophic failure of his own. The sight was so overwhelming, so contrary to everything he knew, that he could not speak. He just stood there, swaying on his feet, his beard caked with ice, staring into the impossible warmth. "My son," he finally managed to stammer, his voice a hoarse croak. "He is the cold." He did not need to finish the sentence. Ilara simply nodded. "Bring your family," she said. Her voice was soft. There was no hint of, "I told you so," no gloating. It was a simple, compassionate instruction. He nodded, tears freezing on his cheeks, and stumbled back out into the vestibule, back into the storm, a man whose entire world had been upended by a wave of warm air. He returned minutes later, half carrying his wife, while his older son helped their little brother. They stumbled through the vestibule and into the cabin, a miserable, frozen procession. Elara helped them out of their frozen outer garments and sat them down, handing them mugs of warm broth. Magnus's wife began to weep, not from misery, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of the warmth. His youngest son, wrapped in a blanket near the stove, slowly stopped shivering. Magnus sat on a small stool, looking around the room. He saw no magic, just a small, efficient stove, well-sealed walls, and the simple, solid door that led to the stone vestibule. It was a victory of intelligence over brute force, of wisdom over pride. By the third day, the storm broke. The wind died down, and a weak, pale sun shone on a transformed world. Providence was a landscape of enormous, sculpted snowdrifts. As the settlers began to dig themselves out, a strange pattern emerged. One by one, drawn by necessity or curiosity, they made their way to Elara's cabin. A neighbor needing to borrow flour, another checking to see if the widow and her children had survived. Each one of them had the same experience. They would knock on the crude outer door, step into the shockingly still and cold vestibule, and then, upon entering the cabin, be struck dumb by the impossible, gentle warmth inside. The news spread through the settlement like wildfire, passed in hushed, awestruck tones. The widow's cabin was warm, not just survivable, but warm, comfortable, while the rest of them had been freezing, burning through their entire winter supply of wood in 3 days. She had been living in calm and safety. The laughter and mockery were replaced by a stunned, respectful silence. The widow's ice house was no longer a joke. It was a miracle. The men who had laughed the loudest were now the most silent. They looked at the squat stone structure with new eyes. They saw not a foolish lump, but a work of genius that had been utterly beyond their comprehension. A week after the great storm, Magnus returned to Elara's cabin. He did not come for shelter this time. He came alone. He knocked on her outer door and waited in the vestibule, his hat in his hands. When she opened the inner door, he did not try to enter. He stood on the cold stone floor, looking at her. The arrogant, booming man was gone. In his place was a humbled, tired man, seeking a truth he had once ridiculed. "Elara," he said, his voice quiet and heavy with remorse. "I was wrong. I was a fool. What we thought was wisdom was just pride." He paused, gathering his courage. "What you have built here, it saved my family. Now, I ask you, will you teach me?" Elara looked at him for a long moment. Then she gave a small nod. She did not ask for an apology. She did not demand any payment or special status. The vindication was in the request itself. "Tomorrow," she said, "at midday, bring whoever wishes to learn." She stepped back and closed the door, leaving him standing in the cold, but with a new warmth of hope. The next day, nearly every man in Providence gathered in front of her cabin. They were a somber, attentive crowd. The men who had laughed stood shoulder to shoulder with the men who had pitied her. Magnus was at the front, his face earnest. Elara came out, with Lisa and Tomas holding her hands. She walked to the spot where she had first drawn the rectangle in the dirt, weeks before. The snow was thick, but she kicked it away, revealing the hard ground. She picked up a stick. She didn't make a speech. She simply began to explain. She drew in the dirt again, showing them the principles. "The cold is heavy," she said, her voice carrying in the still winter air. "You give it a place to fall." She drew the sunken floor of the vestibule. "The wind is a bully. You give it a wall to break against, a room to tire itself in." She sketched the thick stone walls and the 2 doors. "A house must be sealed. Your heat is precious. Do not give it away. Every time you open your door, you are inviting the winter inside as a guest." She spoke of thermal mass, not in the language of physics, but in the simple, practical terms her grandfather had used. The stone drinks the cold. It holds it, so the air inside your home does not have to. The men listened. They leaned in, their faces tight with concentration. They asked questions, not with skepticism, but with a desperate desire to understand. Magnus acted as her apprentice, asking her to clarify points, repeating her lessons to ensure the others grasped them. "So, the space between the doors is the most important part?" one man asked. "It is the air itself that becomes the barrier," Ilara confirmed. "Still air is a blanket." It was a revelation. They had spent their lives fighting the cold. She was teaching them how to manage it, how to outwit it. She was giving them not just a blueprint, but a new way of thinking. The knowledge was shared freely, a gift given without expectation. Her quiet triumph was not in being right. It was in the act of teaching, in the sharing of a wisdom that would save them all. That spring, as the great snowdrifts melted and the prairie turned from white to green, a new sound was heard in Providence. It was the chipping of stone and the scraping of trowels. A transformation was underway. On cabin after cabin, the men began to build. They dug foundations. They hauled stones from the creek bed. They built thick, solid walls around their front doors. They followed the design Ilara had shared, working with the patient precision she had modeled. Magnus, the settlement's lead builder, was the most diligent of all. He supervised the work, ensuring that every vestibule was built correctly, explaining the principles to anyone who was still unsure. He called it Ilara's porch. By the time the following winter approached, the face of Providence had changed. Every cabin now had a squat, solid stone vestibule attached to its front. The ugly little boxes were now badges of honor, symbols of a hard-won lesson in humility. When the cold came that year, it was just as fierce. The winds howled and the snows fell. But inside the cabins of Providence, there was warmth. There was calm. Firewood supplies lasted. Children played on the floors. The constant hacking cough of winter was gone. They had not defeated the winter, but they had learned how to live with it. They had learned to respect it, and in doing so, had found a way to rob it of its terror. The story of Providence and its stone vestibules spread. Travelers passing through saw the strange additions and asked about them. They would be told the story of the great storm and the widow who had saved them. Surveyors and land agents took note of the design. The idea, so simple and so effective, began to appear in other settlements across the territory. It was given different names: a Dakota airlock, a settler's vestibule, a cold sink, but everyone who knew its origins called it Ilara's porch. It became a piece of prairie wisdom, a fundamental element of survival, its genesis in the quiet mind of an underestimated woman. Ilara never sought credit or praise. She remained a quiet member of the community, respected and admired, but unchanged by her vindication. Her greatest satisfaction came from watching her children grow up healthy and strong, safe from the brutal cold that had once threatened them. Years later, when Lisa was grown and had children of her own, she asked her mother if she had ever been angry at the men who had laughed at her. Ilara, now an old woman with kind eyes and hands softened by time, looked out at the settlement, at the sturdy stone porches on every home. "Anger is a fire that warms no one," she said softly. They did not know. Once they knew, they learned. That is the only thing that matters. The true legacy was not in the stone and mortar. It was in the lesson that the most profound wisdom is often quiet, that the most revolutionary ideas can come from the most unexpected places, and that true strength is not the force with which you fight, but the wisdom with which you endure.